Hey guys, tonight we spend time inside the medieval castle, not the version from paintings where everything is gleaming and the lord is always just on the verge of making a noble speech, but the actual version, the one with cold stone and complicated politics, and a set of unwritten rules so precise and so quietly lethal that getting them wrong could end your career, your freedom, or depending on the day and the lord, your continued presence among the living. Then we follow William Marshal, the greatest knight of medieval England, a man who entered the world as a child hostage whose own father calculated him expendable, and somehow spent the next 70 years proving that calculation wrong, which is the kind of career arc that really does make you think about what a person can build from almost nothing when they decide their word is the one thing they will not compromise. After that, we take a post at the castle gate, the most consequential threshold in the medieval world, where every person who arrives with a story is either who they say they are or they are not, and your job is to know the difference, and the consequences of getting it wrong run in both directions in ways that are not comfortable to think about for very long. And finally, we look at what was actually happening inside the great halls and private chambers of castle life, the world behind the ceremony and the heraldry and the very expensive tapestries that were mostly there to keep the cold from coming through the wall, and occasionally to hide the door that led somewhere the visitors were not supposed to know about. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the castle and the first thing your body tells you is that you have miscalculated something. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself with any single clear signal, but in the particular way your body communicates when you have accepted a situation without fully understanding what accepting it means. The castle is larger than you expected. Not larger in the way that a beautiful building surprises you by being more impressive in person than it was in your imagination. That pleasant expansion of scale that makes you feel briefly like the world is bigger and better than you thought. Larger in the way that makes you smaller. The walls rise above the road at a height that feels, on some level that is beneath thinking about it, personal. As if the castle is not simply a structure but a statement, and the statement is about your relationship to it, and the relationship is one of significant power imbalance. The stone is not the warm golden stone of tapestries and manuscript illustrations. It is grey, pale grey with the specific dampness of something that spends most of its time in the English climate, and it goes upward at an angle that contains no apology for its height or its thickness. The battlements at the top are not decorative. They are functional, and their function is the management of violence, specifically the management of projectiles released from one side, and the prevention of projectiles arriving from the other. And the thought that went into making them effective at this purpose is visible in their form if you know how to look at it, which you do not, yet, but you will learn. The towers at the corners are not symmetrical ornaments. They are fighting platforms designed for overlapping fields of fire, each one covering the approaches to the next, so that attacking the wall from any angle exposes you to fire from at least two directions simultaneously. This is excellent military engineering. It is not welcoming. You have been told this was a good placement. You have been told that service in this household offers advancement, proper training in the running of a great establishment, proximity to people and events that matter to the region and potentially to the kingdom. You have been told these things by people who believe them, or at least who believe that telling you will help you believe them, which is its own form of optimism. You look at the walls, you adjust your understanding of what good means in the context of this particular arrangement. The gate is closed. This is your first practical lesson, and it costs you nothing except standing in the cold while you wait for it to be addressed, which is its own cost in the particular penetrating cold of an English morning in the late part of the year, a cold that is not dramatic or exceptional, but is very persistent and soaks into you through your coat and your shoes and your recently formed optimism about how this day was going to begin. The guards at the gate are present and aware of you. They have not yet decided to do anything about you. This is not quite hostility. It is the professional neutrality of men whose job is to control who comes through the gate, and who have found that extending casual helpfulness to strangers is not always the most productive use of their attention. You state your business. You produce the letter. One of the guards examines it with the expression of someone who is establishing that they have seen it, not necessarily that they have read it. Then he exchanges something with his colleague, less a look than a slight adjustment of posture, the specific communication of two people who have worked together long enough to have developed a private language of minor movements. Then someone is sent. Then you wait, standing in the cold with your belongings and your expectations, both of which feel heavier than when you started the day. The portcullis rises. The sound it makes is one of the first distinctive sounds of your new life, a sustained mechanical groan of chains and counterweights that has in it the quality of something large submitting to pressure rather than something welcoming you in. You file through the gate tunnel, which is narrow and stone-walled and darker than the road behind you, and above you are the murder holes, which you know about in the way that people know about features of buildings they have been told about before arriving at them, abstractly and without the specific unease of being directly beneath them. The murder holes are functional. They are there so that if someone gets this far and should not have gotten this far, the people above can address that without exposing themselves to the road. You walk a little faster through the tunnel, not conspicuously, just enough. The inner courtyard opens in front of you, and for a moment you stop, involuntarily, because after the tunnel and the walls and the cold, it is something other than what you expected. It is busy, not ceremonially busy, not the organised display of an occasion with retainers in formation and banners arranged for effect. Ordinarily busy. A man carrying split timber across the yard at the angle-forward pace of someone who has carried timber across this exact yard hundreds of times and has long since internalised the optimal path. Two women crossing from the kitchen building toward a low storage structure in the middle of a conversation that neither of them intends to interrupt for the sake of their own movement, the conversation continuing through the crossing and into the doorway without a pause. A boy leading a horse toward the stables, the horse considerably taller than the boy and visibly aware of this, and the boy managing the situation with the calm grip of someone who has made his own peace with the power differential and found it workable. A horse is being shod in the corner near the smithy, the familiar ring of hammer on metal carrying across the yard with the particular clarity that metalwork has in cold, still air. Near the well, two men are discussing something in tones too low to hear, their conversation shaped by the body language of colleagues who disagree about something that needs to be resolved before afternoon. The chickens are doing what chickens do in a castle courtyard, which is to conduct their own business with the specific confidence of animals that understand themselves to be marginally useful, and therefore largely immune to interruption. A cat moves along the base of the granary wall, with the exact focus of an animal on a specific errand that does not include you. A castle in operation is not a castle at ceremony. The version in the accounts and the histories, the great feasts and the formal receptions and the lord in his hall, hearing the cases of his tenants, that version exists, but it is the surface of something far more mechanical and constant. Underneath the ceremony is this, the daily movement and work and noise of a large institution maintaining itself across all the hours that are not ceremonial. Food has to be prepared 3 times a day for a household that numbers in the dozens. Equipment deteriorates and must be repaired. Animals require feeding and management and the regular attention of people who understand them. The structure itself requires ongoing care, because stone and wood and iron in the English climate tend toward decay at a pace that does not respect the household's schedule. All of this is happening. It was happening before you arrived, and it has not paused to acknowledge your arrival, which is itself information about your place in the picture. You are shown to the steward, who reads your letter with the focused efficiency of a man who processes information at speed, because processing it slowly is a luxury the management of a large household does not offer. He tells you what you will be doing initially, where you will be sleeping, and the basic architecture of behaviour that the household requires. He tells you not to be late, not to lie, not to enter rooms you have not been invited to enter, and that if you are uncertain whether you have been invited, you have not been. He tells you that if you do not understand an instruction, you ask the person who gave it to you and not the nearest person, because the nearest person will give you their interpretation, which is not the same thing. He tells you to keep your belongings secured, not because anyone will definitely take them, but because loose belongings become arguments, and arguments waste time that belongs to the household rather than to the argument. He tells you the chapel bell controls the day, and your relationship to it should be one of complete compliance. Then he sends someone to show you to your sleeping space, and returns his attention to whatever he was managing before you arrived, with the specific efficiency of someone who measures their time in small and expensive units, and has just spent some of it on you and expects it to have been worthwhile. Your sleeping space is in one of the service buildings, a long, low structure built of the same grey stone as the rest of the castle, with a packed earth floor that has been beaten smooth by the passage of many feet over many years, and with a roof that is functional in the primary sense of remaining above you and not entirely functional in the secondary sense of providing any meaningful resistance to the movement of cold air. It is full of the smells of many people in an enclosed space, sweat and leather, and the particular undertone of damp wool that is the base note of medieval winter indoor life. Several other people have their spaces here already, their arrangements of straw and blanket and personal items establishing the informal geography of who lives where, and they look at you with the mild assessment of people who have absorbed new arrivals before, and understand that new arrivals either adapt or they leave, and the timeline for that determination is shorter than most new arrivals expect. You find a space, you put down your belongings. The wall beside your pallet is cold in the specific way that very thick stone walls are cold, which is not the cold of something that is currently being chilled, but the cold of something that has stored cold over years and decades and will continue to release it regardless of what the season is doing. You press your hand against the stone. It is like pressing your hand against accumulated time, which would be poetic if it were not also genuinely uncomfortable. Morning is earlier than you are prepared for, which is itself information about the gap between what you expected this life to require and what it actually requires. The chapel bell does not build toward waking you. It simply begins, with the complete confidence of an institution that has been waking people before they were ready to wake up for longer than anyone alive can remember, and whose relationship to your personal readiness is one of total indifference. You are on your feet, and you are not the first person on your feet, and being not the first person on your feet in a castle household, when the bell has already rung, is a situation that generates its own mild social pressure that is less than formal censure and more than nothing. The people around you are moving with the economy of people who have been waking into the same routine for long enough that the transition from sleep to motion is essentially seamless. You scramble into your coat, you locate your shoes, you step into the courtyard, and the cold of the morning settles around you immediately, without hesitation, as if it has been waiting. The first rule you learn, not because anyone states it, but because you observe its application to others and then apply it to yourself, is that visibility matters more than effort in a world where effort cannot always be directly observed and visibility is constant. In a castle household where everyone shares space, where the hierarchy depends on ongoing assessment of who is doing what and how well and how consistently, being seen to do your work correctly and at the right time is not decoration on top of doing your work, it is the work. Understood properly, the courtyard is observed from multiple angles at all times. The great hall when the household is gathered is a room where nothing goes unnoticed because nothing happens in isolation. You do not perform for an audience at specific moments. You perform continuously because the audience is always present, and the audience is everyone you work with, and their assessments accumulate. You begin arriving at places slightly before you're expected. You complete tasks visibly rather than rushing them in corners. You make yourself easy to find when people need something done, and hard to find when the timing would make you conspicuous for the wrong reasons. This is not dishonesty, it is navigation. The castle runs on the management of impression as much as it runs on the management of supply and equipment and defence, and learning to navigate that management is learning to function in the institution. The cold settles into you over weeks in a way you did not anticipate because the discomfort is not dramatic. There is no single terrible day. There is instead a persistent and relentless accumulation of cold that becomes the ambient condition of existence, and against which the fires in the Great Hall fight a daily battle that they win only in a radius of about 10 feet, beyond which warmth diminishes steadily toward the ambient temperature of several feet of stone that have been absorbing the English climate for decades. Your place in the household's hierarchy is not the kind of place that situates you within 10 feet of the fire. You are further from it. You wear your coat inside. Everyone wears their coat inside, except at the high table, where the performance of not minding the cold is part of the performance of rank. Food arrives at the lower tables in a form that reflects the logic of medieval provisioning, rather than the priorities of medieval dining as depicted in illuminated manuscripts. The high table is a genuine display. roasted meats and pastries and preserved fruits and wine in quantities that communicate the household's wealth to anyone at any table in the hall who cares to look toward the dais and compare. The high table is theatre, partly the visible argument for the Lord's capacity to provide. What reaches your table is adequately filling and sufficiently basic. Bread, which is dense and present at every meal, and around which the day is organised in a way that makes you realise bread was not a side element in this diet, but the foundation of it. Pottage, the thick-grained soup that appears with the daily regularity of something that has decided it is the default state of food and will not be argued with about this. Occasionally meat, or the broth from meat, in quantities that reflect your position in the hierarchy clearly and without elaboration. The smell of the castle is something you stop noticing after a month, which tells you less about how the smell has changed, and more about how your sense of what is normal has been recalibrated. The primary register is smoke, because fires burn everywhere and constantly, and stone spaces concentrate the smell of combustion in a way that open air never does. Below the smoke is the smell of animals, horses in the stables, and the Lord's hunting dogs who have a largely unrestricted relationship with the courtyard, and the chickens and various other creatures that are part of the functional economy of the household. Below the animals is the smell of many people in close quarters, the specific combination of sweat and wool and unwashed hair that constitutes the baseline olfactory experience of a medieval institution in winter. And in certain corners and certain passages, there is the smell of the management of human biology in a large household without any infrastructure that would be recognisable as sanitation in a modern context. The guardrobes, the small toilet chambers built into the wall, function by directing waste outward from the structure, either into a pit or into the moat, and the functional assessment of this arrangement is that it is better than the alternative, and the olfactory assessment of it is that better than the alternative does not mean pleasant. The hierarchy of the castle is written in the grammar of space and precedence and service, and it is written so thoroughly and so constantly that it is impossible to move through the castle without reading it. The Lord sits at the high table on the raised dais at the far end of the hall. Everyone else sits below him, in an arrangement that is both literal and symbolic, and the gradient from the dais down through the various tables is a legible map of status that can be read accurately by anyone inside the institution and by most people from outside it who understand the conventions. Where you sit tells people who you are. What you are served tells people what the household thinks of you. When you're permitted to speak, and to whom and in what register, calibrates your position with a precision that formal announcement never achieves, because formal announcement is an event and the table is daily. You watch and you calibrate. You watch who speaks first and who waits. You watch who moves through which spaces freely and who slows at certain thresholds, with the specific adjustment of someone who is checking whether the space is currently appropriate for their presence. You watch how the senior household members conduct themselves in the Lord's presence, which is not so much watchful deference as it is a kind of alertness, a quality of orientation toward the Lord's mood and attention that allows for immediate adjustment if the mood changes or the attention shifts. You begin to practice this orientation yourself, not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. The rules of the castle that were not given to you in the steward's initial briefing reveal themselves through experience rather than instruction. Some of them are rules about timing, about when certain things are done and not done, about the specific windows in the day's schedule that are and are not appropriate for various activities. Some are rules about speech, about who may address whom directly, and who must go through intermediaries, about the context in which informality is permitted and the context in which informality would be read as presumption. Some are rules about posture and movement, about how you hold yourself when the Lord passes through a space, about how you orient your body relative to people above you in the hierarchy in ways that communicate the correct relationship without requiring words. The weapons rules you learn early and permanently. You do not carry a sword into the Great Hall. You do not carry any weapon into the Lord's presence unless you are of the rank that makes your weapon a symbol of your status, rather than a potential threat to his safety, and you are not of that rank. This is not formally explained to you as a rule because it is so fundamental to the functioning of the institution that explaining it would be like explaining that you do not walk into someone else's sleeping space and rearrange their belongings. It is simply understood. What you learn, as the weeks pass, is that the weapons rules are part of a broader system of authorization that governs who is armed in what spaces and with what implicit permissions, and that this system is one of the more important invisible structures of castle life. The garrison carries weapons in specific authorized contexts. Visiting knights arrive armed and their weapons are acknowledged in the protocol of reception, because their weaponry is part of their identity and their rank. The castle smith's apprentice carries tools that are not weapons, even when those tools could theoretically function as weapons, because the context establishes what they are. These distinctions are not written down anywhere. They are held in place by the collective social agreement of the institution, and that agreement is reinforced by the genuine consequences that attach to violating it. Months accumulate, and the castle becomes known to you in the way that any place becomes known when you live inside it and pay attention to it, which is to say not comprehensively and not without gaps, but in the deep particular way of someone who has walked the same flagstones in all weathers and all hours, and knows where they are uneven, and where they are slick, and where the shadow of the wall falls in midwinter, so that a certain corner of the courtyard stays frozen until nearly midday. You know the face of the baker's delivery boy, who comes 3 times a week, and whose relationship to punctuality is one of impressive consistency. You know the sound of the armourer's workroom from 3 buildings away, the particular rhythm of the work that means ordinary operations and the change in that rhythm that means something is being prepared urgently. You know the exact pitch of the chapel bell that indicates the ordinary sequence of services and the slightly different quality it has when the household is being called to something specific. A pattern difference so subtle that you did not notice it for the first 2 months, and now cannot imagine not noticing. The castle has become somewhere you know, not loved exactly, not comfortable in any conventional sense, but understood, and understanding a place is not nothing. It is the baseline on which everything else that happens there becomes navigable. There are men in medieval history who appear to have been assembled, almost deliberately, to demonstrate what the ideas of the era could produce in human form, and who seem, at first glance, more like constructions of narrative necessity than actual people. William Marshal is this man, and the thing that keeps him from being simply a legend is that the historical record, which is unusually detailed and unusually specific for a person of his era and his original station, shows someone who was entirely real, entirely human, entirely specific in the choices he made and the cost those choices carried. He was not more than human. He was precisely human, which in the context of what he survived and what he built is remarkable enough on its own terms. He was born in the late 1130s, almost certainly around 1147, the 4th son of John Marshal, a man whose title, Marshal of England, sounds grand, and whose actual resources were modest by the standards of what the title suggested. John Marshal was a court official, a man with access rather than land, and the distinction mattered enormously in a society where land was the foundation of everything. Landed wealth meant income, meant the ability to maintain retainers, meant the social and political weight that translated into real power. Access without land meant proximity to power, without the resources to exercise it independently, a position that was useful for some purposes and very constrained for others. John Marshal's sons, particularly his younger sons, inherited the access and not the land, and they would have to find their own way in a world that had given them the starting point of gentle birth, without the material to build on it. William was the 4th. The hierarchy among brothers in medieval noble families was not cruel exactly, but it was absolute. The eldest son inherited the primary estate. The others received fragments, or positions, or the expectation that they would make their own arrangements. The church absorbed many younger sons. Military service absorbed the others. For William, the choice was the sword, not because it was forced upon him, but because it suited something in his temperament, some quality of directness and physical presence and competitive intelligence that fit the profession better than the alternatives. Before he was old enough to choose anything, however, the world chose for him in a way that most children are spared. In 1152, when William was approximately 5 years old, his father was engaged in the murky, violent, constantly shifting politics of the anarchy, the period during which Stephen of Blois and the Empress Matilda contested the English throne, and the country's barons navigated their own interests in the space that contested sovereignty creates. John Marshal had made commitments to Stephen. He then found reasons to break those commitments, or found that circumstances had changed in ways that made keeping them strategically unwise, or perhaps simply found that a better offer had arrived, because the barons of the anarchy period were not noted for their consistency in such matters. Stephen needed leverage. The traditional mechanism of leverage in this situation was the hostage, specifically the Lord's child, whose life was placed in the custody of the offended party as surety for future compliance. John Marshal sent his son William to Stephen's camp. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Stephen threatened to kill the child, not as a rhetorical device, as a credible military threat designed to produce a specific outcome, which was John Marshal's surrender of a disputed castle. He had William displayed before the walls. He announced that if John did not comply, the child would die, by hanging or by being loaded into a siege engine and catapulted over the walls back to his father. The accounts vary on the specific mechanism threatened. The threat was designed to work because it was designed to engage the thing that most people, most parents, place above political calculations: the life of their child. John Marshal did not place the life of his child above his political calculations. He announced in words that have survived in the historical record with a specificity that suggests they were preserved because they were remarkable, that he had the hammers and the anvils necessary to make more sons. Then he did not surrender. Stephen did not execute William. This decision, which looks like a reprieve for the child and which functionally was won, is also one of the most revealing moments in Stephen's kingship. He could not do it. He was the wrong kind of man for the role he occupied, possessed of genuine personal decency and genuine political weakness, in a period that required the opposite of those qualities. He kept William in his camp instead, and treated him not badly. Some accounts suggest Stephen played games with the boy, genuine casual play, the kind of interaction between a king and a hostage child that produced in William a specific and complicated knowledge that the person who had threatened to kill you could also, in person, be kind, and that the threat and the kindness were not contradictions, but both simply parts of what power looked like from close up. What the experience gave William was something that a less formative version of it might not have given him. It gave him an early and extremely concrete understanding that his safety was not guaranteed by the people responsible for it. His father had calculated him expendable. His captor had been unable to follow through on the threat, but had made it credibly enough that the gap between intention and action was visible to any 5-year-old paying attention. He had survived through fortune and through the specific decency of a man who was too kind to be an effective medieval king. This was not the foundation that comfortable children stand on. It was the foundation that people who understand the world clearly stand on. William stood on it for the rest of his life, and the thing he built on it was the decision that the one thing he would control, the one variable that was entirely his, was whether his word meant what it said. His training as a knight began in earnest in the household of William de Tankerville, a Norman lord in whose service he spent his formative years and where he received the full curriculum of the 12th century military education. The curriculum was extensive and demanding and conducted in conditions of genuine physical difficulty. Horsemanship was the foundation, not the riding you do for pleasure or for travel, but the horsemanship of combat, which required a different kind of skill entirely, the ability to manage a very large and powerful animal at speed, in armour, in the chaotic and frightening conditions of actual violence, where the horse is also frightened and must be controlled by a rider who is simultaneously managing his own weapon and his own survival. This took years of practice before it became reliable, and years more before it became instinct, and the training method was the method of a world that did not have the concept of progressive exposure to risk. You practiced by doing the difficult thing, and the difficulty of the thing was the practice. Swordsmanship, the management of weapons in their various forms, the halberd and the lance and the various tools of mounted and dismounted combat, the physical conditioning that the work required, not the systematic conditioning of a modern training program, but the accumulated hardening of a body that is consistently asked to do difficult physical things in difficult physical conditions until it becomes capable of doing them reliably. The protocols of chivalric conduct, which were simultaneously genuine ethical commitments, practical rules for managing the social dynamics of a military class, and performed identity, the way a knight's behaviour announced who he was in a world where identity was not carried in documents. William was not the most naturally gifted student in the household. The historical record is specific about this. in the way that it is specific about things that are interesting precisely because they deviate from the legendary shape of the narrative. He was large and strong, he was eventually extraordinarily skilled, but the skill came from work rather than from any innate grace that shortened the path. He worked harder than the people around him because he understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has never had anything given to him, and has therefore never been confused about what it costs to have things, that thoroughness was the only reliable foundation available to him. He had no estate to fall back on, no inheritance that would soften the consequences of being merely good rather than excellent. If he was going to build a life out of military service, the life would be as good as his skill, and his skill would be as good as his work, and there was no shortcut between the starting point and the outcome. His tournament career began after his knighting, probably in the early 1160s, and extended through the decade and into the next with a consistency of success that built his reputation before he fully understood what he was building. The tournament of this period is worth dwelling on because it bore almost no resemblance to the later tournament, the ceremonial occasion with controlled combat and theatrical pageantry, and the management of risk to the point where death was rare and everyone went home more or less intact. The tournament of William Marshal's career was a genuinely dangerous military exercise conducted across open countryside, sometimes covering miles, involving dozens or hundreds of mounted knights in the organised chaos of a military engagement, where the goal was to capture opponents for ransom, and the risk was everything that genuine combat involved, up to and including death. The economics of this enterprise were straightforward. Captured knights paid ransom for their release. Ransom was money. Money bought horses and equipment and the ability to continue participating in the tournament circuit. The circuit was the career, the mechanism by which a landless knight could build wealth and reputation, and eventually the kind of standing that attracted the notice of lords who needed capable people in their households. The tournament was, in this era, not a social occasion but an industry, and William approached it as an industry, with the systematic attention of someone building a business rather than the romantic enthusiasm of someone seeking glory. His specific genius in the tournament, the thing that set him apart from skilled contemporaries and built a reputation that spread faster than he could ride, was restraint. He fought to capture rather than to wound severely or to kill. He identified the moment of maximum leverage in a combat and applied it efficiently to take his opponent prisoner, then managed the ransom process with the consistency of someone who understood that the ransom was the entire point and that the fight was merely the mechanism of getting to the ransom. He took care of his horses and his equipment. He reinvested his earnings with the discipline of someone who knew that the tournament circuit could sustain a career only as long as he could sustain his participation in it, and sustaining participation required managing resources rather than consuming them. And he honoured his commitments, every time. When he gave his word to a ransomed opponent, the opponent received exactly what had been agreed, in the time that had been agreed, without renegotiation or delay, or the small manipulations that some knights employed when their opponents had the lesser leverage of captivity. This was not sentimentality, it was strategic clarity. In a world with no formal credit mechanisms and no legal enforcement of private agreements between equals, personal reputation was the only functioning form of trust, and trust was worth more than any individual ransom. Being known as someone whose word held meant being treated as someone whose word could be relied upon, which meant faster and smoother transactions in the future, which meant a competitive advantage that compounded over time. William understood this. He behaved accordingly, and the reputation accumulated exactly as he had correctly predicted it would. His entry into the orbit of the Plantagenet royal family came with his placement in the household of Henry the young king, the eldest son of Henry II of England, as military tutor and companion. This was a significant step, the kind that a fourth son of a minor baron arrived at only after his reputation had preceded him sufficiently far. The young Henry was charming, talented in the martial arts that William was teaching, generous with the resources that his father provided him, and constitutionally unsuited to the patience required by a man who held the title of king without the authority that went with it. He had been crowned during his father's lifetime in a ceremony intended to secure the succession, and the effect of that ceremony was to create a prince who was king in every formal sense, and could not govern, who had all the dignity and none of the power, and who found this state of affairs progressively harder to accept as he got older and more capable and more surrounded by men who pointed out, in various ways, how unreasonable the situation was. William fought beside him on the tournament circuit through the late 1160s and into the 1170s. He managed the household, he advised. He was the presence that every prince in that situation needed and rarely found. Someone whose personal loyalty was genuine rather than calculated, whose competence was real rather than performed, and whose honesty about difficult things was not softened by the desire to remain in favour. The young Henry trusted William the way people trust someone who has consistently not let them down, over a period long enough to establish a pattern. The rebellion of 1173 put William in the direct path of the central contradiction of loyalty, in a world with multiple competing obligations. The young Henry rose against his father, backed by his brothers and his mother and the political ambitions of the French crown, and William was in his household when the rising began. He followed his lord. This is the simple statement of what he did. The complicated question beneath it is whether he had a choice, and the answer is that he had a choice in the technical sense that every person in every situation has a choice, and that the choice he made was not the path of least resistance. It was the path of maximum consistency with what he had committed himself to being. Breaking his loyalty to the young Henry at the moment of maximum pressure on that loyalty would have been strategically intelligible. Henry II was going to win. The rebellion was going to fail. William could read a military situation. He knew which way this was going, and the intelligent strategic response to knowing which way things are going is to be on the right side when they get there. He did not do the intelligent strategic thing. He stayed with his lord. He followed the young Henry through the failed rebellion, not because he was naive about the consequences, but because his word had been given and the word held. Even here, even when holding it cost him. The rebellion collapsed. Henry II proved the more capable military and political operator, which he always had been. The young Henry was forgiven, because the king was his father, and even ruthless medieval kings generally found it difficult to execute their own eldest sons without consequences that extended well beyond the execution. William was not punished. Henry II, whose management of threats to his authority was thorough and unsentimental, chose to interpret William's loyalty to the young prince not as opposition to the king, but as the fulfillment of the obligation that the entire social order depended on being functional. Punishing a man for keeping faith with his lord, when the social compact required keeping faith with one's lord, would send exactly the wrong message to every man in every household across the kingdom about what was actually expected of them. The years between the rebellion and the death of the young Henry in 1183 were years of continued service, continued tournament competition, the deepening of a relationship between William and the prince that was, by the accounts we have, genuine. The young Henry loved William in the way that people love those who are consistently what they say they are, without performance and without ambiguity. When the prince died of dysentery in the south of France, an unheroic end for a man who had built his entire identity around martial greatness, William was at his side. The dying prince gave William his crusader's cloak, asked him to carry it to Jerusalem. William did. He travelled to the Holy Land. He fulfilled the vow. He came back. There was no reward attached to this, and there was no expectation of one. He had said he would do it. He did it. The years that followed brought him into the service of Henry II directly, then Richard I after Henry's death in 1189, then through the fraught and complicated reign of John, and eventually to the extraordinary conclusion of his career as Regent of England for the young Henry III. He was given the earldom of Pembroke through his marriage to Isabella de Clare, whose lands in England and Ireland transformed him from a wealthy and respected military figure into one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. He managed these lands with the same systematic competence he had brought to everything else, and Isabella herself was a capable partner in the management, a woman whose intelligence and administrative skill contributed significantly to what the earldom became under their joint management. The reign of John tested William in ways that the more stable reigns of his predecessors had not. John was suspicious, erratic, brilliantly analytical in moments and deeply self-defeating in others, a king who could read a situation accurately and then consistently choose the response that made it worse. He suspected William at various points, for reasons that were sometimes based on genuine ambiguity and sometimes based on nothing that could be substantiated. William endured the suspicion without either crumpling into excessive reassurance or making the mistake of appearing indignant. He continued being what he was. He did his job. He honoured his commitments. The suspicion passed, as groundless suspicion tends to when it has nothing to feed on, and William remained, as he had always remained, the most reliable person in whatever room he was in. When John died in 1216, the crown fell to a 9-year-old boy, and France was pressing its claim to the English throne through military force, and the baronial coalition that had supported French intervention was still in the field, and the treasury was substantially depleted, and the kingdom was fractured in ways that had not been fully healed since the beginning of the crisis. William Marshal was appointed regent. He was somewhere in his early 70s. The appointment was not ceremonial. It was a recognition that the situation required exactly what William had been building for 7 decades. A reputation so solid and so consistent that all parties, regardless of their other disagreements, could trust that whatever William said would be what he did. He governed. He negotiated. He managed the baronial factions with a combination of firmness and pragmatism that the situation required, offering enough accommodation to make continued opposition more costly than settlement, and holding firm on the things that needed holding. He maintained the loyalties that were functional and addressed the ones that were wavering, and when the military situation required resolution, at Lincoln in 1217, he was there. Somewhere in his early to mid-70s, he led the royalist forces in the field. He commanded, he fought, he won. The battle secured the young king's position and effectively ended the baronial rebellion and the French intervention simultaneously. He died in 1219. He had been well enough to attend the coronation of the young Henry III in 1216 and spent his final years managing the settlement of the kingdom with the steady patience of a man who had been managing difficult things for so long that the management itself had become natural. He took the habit of the Knights Templar on his deathbed, a final commitment to something larger than the political world he was leaving. He died surrounded by his family in a bed, peacefully, at an age that was genuinely remarkable for a man of his profession and his era. The verse biography commissioned shortly after his death called him the greatest knight who ever lived. The phrase has been repeated so many times that it has the ring of conventional tribute, the kind of thing said about prominent men in their memorial literature because convention demands something large and superlative. In his case, convention was simply accurate. He had begun as a child whose father handed him to an enemy as a disposable guarantee. He ended as the man who saved the English crown. Everything in between was the product of a single decision made very young and maintained very consistently. That his word would mean what it said, and that the meaning would hold under every pressure the world could generate. It held, every time. That is what 7 decades of kept promises looks like when you add them up. It looks, from a distance, like greatness. Up close, it looks like work. You take the post at the gatehouse because it is offered, and in a castle household what is offered is what you accept, and the acceptance carries no guarantee that you have fully understood what you have accepted until the work is in your hands and you are standing at the gate and the road is in front of you and a person is arriving and you have to decide something. Your gatehouse is a solid, functional structure, 2 stories, positioned with military logic at the only entrance to the inner courtyard. The portcullis mechanism occupies the lower story, a system of chains and counterweights, and a windlass that requires sustained physical effort to operate. Your arms, in the first 10 days, develop an ache in the specific muscle groups that the windlass engages, an ache that announces itself each morning like a colleague arriving with complaints. The murder holes above the tunnel are features of the architecture that you have been told about, and that you try to relate to with the clinical detachment of someone who understands function, without needing to dwell on it. You're not always successful at the clinical detachment. Sometimes you walk through the tunnel quickly. The mechanics you learn in the first week: raise the portcullis for authorized arrivals, lower it when they have passed through, keep it lowered at night without exception, and the without exception is not rhetorical, it is operational. It covers the Lord's second cousin arriving at midnight and claiming urgency. It covers the messenger with a sealed communication who says the message cannot wait. It covers every compelling story that the dark side of midnight can produce. Keep it lowered, send a runner, wait for authorization, then raise it. This clarity about the mechanics is useful. The clarity runs out when you reach the judgment. Your senior colleague has been at this gate for 11 years. He is a man of approximately 40 whose relationship to expressions of emotion is one of professional economy. Not because he is dull, but because he is someone who has made decisions at this gate for a decade and understands that displays of uncertainty or excitement are, in his specific role, liabilities. He explains the visitor hierarchy to you on your third day with the speed and completeness of someone who has delivered the explanation before and calibrates how much detail to include based on how much the person in front of him appears to need. You appear to need the full version. He provides it. Messengers bearing seals from noble houses that the castle has ongoing relations with come through immediately, after a brief courtesy exchange that establishes who they are and who they are coming to see, without verification delays. Messengers bearing seals from houses the castle does not have established relations with wait, while a runner confirms with someone inside who can assess the seal and the sender's credentials. Standing merchants, the suppliers with long-term relationships with the household, whose names appear on the steward's lists, are confirmed against those lists and their goods noted, and they pass. New merchants, those with outstanding arrangements, go to the outer gatehouse and wait for the relevant household official to vouch for them before they enter the inner courtyard. Knights of established allegiance to the lord or to allied households come through with their retinue, but you count the retinue precisely and report the count to the steward's assistant before the day is out. Knights of unknown allegiance do not enter until someone inside has confirmed their status and purpose, and their waiting for this confirmation is not a courtesy matter, it is a security matter, and they are to understand this through the manner of your informing them rather than through any explicit statement. All other categories of arrival, the travelling poor, the wandering pilgrims, the people with undetermined purposes, have specific handling procedures that route them to the appropriate external location without involving the inner gate at all. Your senior colleague explains all of this clearly, then pauses, and his pause has in it the quality of someone setting aside one kind of explanation and preparing to offer another. He says that the categories cover the obvious cases, and the obvious cases account for perhaps half of what actually arrives at the gate. The other half, he says, are the interesting ones. The interesting ones are the cases that fit partly into a category and partly into another, or that seem to fit a category but have something slightly wrong about them, a detail that does not align, a response that is technically correct but lands with a different weight than technical correctness usually has. Judgment is the word he uses, not instinct, because instinct suggests something that arrives without being earned. Judgment, which is what pattern recognition becomes after enough patterns have been observed. The gate, he says, is where the castle meets the world, and the world contains a full range of people with a full range of intentions, and your job is to understand which parts of that range are currently standing in front of you. He looks at you. He says that getting it wrong in either direction has consequences. Let them both in, and one day something comes in that should not have come in. Keep them both out, and you break a relationship that cost years to build. Neither outcome is recoverable quickly. He looks back at the road. You take the measure of this seriously. In your first month, you make several errors. You delay a messenger bearing a recognized seal because your familiarity with the seal's family is incomplete, and you err toward caution when speed was correct. The messenger is irritated. The Lord receives his communication late. You're spoken to about it in the tone of someone explaining a mistake that is fixable. You learn the seals. You spend several evenings reviewing the visual characteristics of the seals of the houses that have regular relations with your Lord's household, the specific differences between similar-looking designs that allow identification without hesitation. You do not make this particular error again. You also, in your third week, allow through a supplier who claimed to be making a delivery for a contractor on the approved list, and whose goods, on later inspection, contained items that had not been ordered, and whose origins were not clear. The situation was resolved without serious consequences. You were informed of the error specifically and in detail. You understood what you had missed, the difference between someone who knew the contractor's name because they were the contractor's regular agent and someone who knew the contractor's name because they had made a point of finding it out. The difference was small. The information leading to the difference was in the goods themselves, in the slight discrepancy between what was on the cart and what the cart should have carried based on the delivery schedule. You learn to check quantities against expectations as a matter of course. Your senior colleague does not praise you or criticize you in ways that go beyond the efficient transmission of information about what happened and why it mattered. He says what is necessary and then says nothing else. This, you begin to understand, is itself instruction in how the job is done. The gate is not a place for commentary. It is a place for assessment and decision, and the precision of the assessment is the skill, and the precision develops through the accumulation of correct assessments over time, and correct assessments require attention rather than discussion. You develop a practice, not a formal system because the cases do not resolve into a formal system, but a practice of observation that becomes more efficient as months pass. You watch arrivals from the first moment they are visible on the road, before they reach the gate and before they know they are being watched, which is when people are most naturally themselves. The way a person rides, not their skill at riding, but the relationship between their body and the horse when they are not performing for anyone, tells you things about their background and their history with horses that the clothes they wear might or might not confirm. People, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. People from households that use horses as a primary means of movement have a specific ease with them that is different from people who ride horses only occasionally. The difference matters when you are assessing whether someone is who they say they are. You watch the way people approach the gate. The person who has legitimate business and is comfortable in their legitimacy arrives differently from the person who is checking how their story is landing. The legitimate arrival has their attention on the gate as a mechanism of passage, something that will be opened because there is no reason for it not to be opened. The person who is managing a story has their attention distributed differently, taking in the guards, taking in the surroundings, processing information that the truly legitimate visitor would not need to process. This difference is not large. It is something in the angle of the eyes, something in the management of stillness. You learn to see it. You learn the difference between the pause before an answer that comes from someone gathering their thoughts and the pause before an answer that comes from someone selecting from among multiple prepared options. The second pause is almost indistinguishable from the first, and for most purposes it is indistinguishable, but for your purposes the difference is the thing you are trying to see. One autumn morning, a group of 6 men arrives at the gate with horses appropriate to their claimed status as retainers of a lord whose name you know, travelling through the region and requesting overnight hospitality, which is a legitimate request and one that the castle's obligations of hospitality require consideration rather than reflexive refusal. You look at them. Their clothing is correct, their horses are appropriate, their manner is confident in the way that men accustomed to moving through the world without their presence being questioned are confident. The man who speaks for them gives the Lord's name correctly, knows the name of the specific knight in your household he is supposedly coming to see, provides a plausible account of their journey and their purpose. Something is wrong. You cannot locate it immediately. It is not in any single thing they have said. It is in the aggregate, in the way all the correct information has been assembled with a smoothness that is just slightly too smooth, the smoothness of rehearsal rather than the smoothness of familiarity. Real stories about real journeys contain details that only appear when something has actually happened. The minor delays, the specific road condition, the place where the weather changed. These are the textures of genuine experience. What you're hearing is accurate but thin, the essential elements without the texture. You ask them to wait. Your senior colleague arrives. He assesses them with the specific quality of attention that 11 years at a gate produces, then asks the spokesman a question about the knight they are supposedly visiting, a question specific enough that only someone with genuine household knowledge would know the answer, and general enough that an impersonator might have covered it. The answer arrives a fraction of a second late, not slowly, not with visible anxiety, just with the smallest measurable delay that distinguishes recalled information from genuine knowledge. Your senior colleague thanks them for their patience and explains there will be a brief delay due to the management of a current delivery. He turns to you and tells you, very quietly, to raise the alarm. You raise it. By the time anything productive can respond, the men are already receding down the road with the efficiency of people who know exactly what has happened and have a plan that accounts for this outcome. What they intended inside the castle is unknown. Your senior colleague does not speculate about it. He returns to the gate. You return to the gate. The road is empty again. The cold morning air settles back into its ordinary quality. The castle behind you continues its operations without interruption, because the interruption did not occur. That is the entirety of the result from the castle's perspective. From your perspective, something has shifted in your understanding of what you are doing here. You're not managing a door, you're managing a threshold, and the threshold is where the castle's safety is either maintained or compromised, and the difference between those outcomes is the quality of your attention on any given morning. The baker's cart comes mid-morning. You know the cart by its wheel sound, a specific rhythm created by the slight warp in the left rear wheel that produces a pattern you have heard dozens of times and would recognize in the dark. You know the older boy by his habit of looking at the sky before he looks at the gate, a small personal ritual of some kind that you have never asked about and do not need to ask about to recognize. The delivery is what the delivery always is. The portcullis rises, the cart passes, the portcullis falls. The morning continues. This is the job, not the dramatic interventions which are rare, but the sustained and consistent management of the ordinary, which is constant. The dramatic moments matter precisely because the ordinary ones are done well, because the gate's reliability is the context in which exceptions are visible and legible. A gate that is routinely unreliable provides no information about the exceptional case. A gate that is routinely impeccable makes the exceptional case legible immediately. You stand in the cold and you watch the road. The road is quiet. The road is never actually empty. It is a corridor through which the world approaches and retreats, continuously, carrying everything the castle needs and everything that would destroy it, usually distinguishable, sometimes not, always requiring the same quality of attention regardless of which one it is. The castle from the road was an argument about certainty. The high walls and the flying banners and the firmly closed gate and the garrison, visible on the battlements, all communicated the same thing. Here is an institution that knows what it is, that has existed before and will continue after, that is organised and powerful and not to be casually challenged. The argument worked. It was believed. In the medieval world, the castle's argument was one of the most effective communications of power available, because the power it communicated was not entirely abstract. The walls were real, the garrison was real, the portcullis and the murder holes and the depth of the moat were real. The argument had teeth. And yet the reality inside the argument was more complicated and more human than the argument suggested, and the gap between the two was not a failure of the image but a feature of it, maintained deliberately and at genuine effort by everyone inside the walls who understood that the image was the foundation on which everything else rested. The first and most persistent complication was the financial one. Running a great castle household was expensive in ways that did not always announce themselves in the great hall's abundance. The visible wealth of the feasting table was real, but it was also the most carefully curated presentation of what the household could produce, and the household's capacity to sustain that production was under ongoing pressure from costs that did not diminish when harvests were poor or political conditions required extra expenditure on the military establishment. The structure itself demanded money continuously. Stone settles and develops faults, mortar weakens and must be repointed, wood rots and must be replaced, iron rusts at the rate that iron rusts in England, which is to say constantly and thoroughly. The castle that had stood for a century was a castle that had been spending on its own maintenance for a century, and the accumulation of that maintenance cost was substantial. The garrison required feeding and equipping and payment of soldiers, when delayed, produced a quality of morale that was not compatible with reliable military service. The household servants required feeding and housing and managing, and the management of people in an enclosed environment where social tensions had no outlet required attention, and sometimes expenditure on the kind of small gestures that prevented larger conflicts. Hospitality was a genuine financial obligation. The castle's rank required that significant visitors be received and entertained at a level that reflected the household's standing, and the level required by standing could be considerably higher than the level justified by immediate resources. A lord who received a major ally inadequately would damage a relationship that might be worth more than the cost of proper reception, and so the reception happened and the cost was managed through the various mechanisms of financial management available to a medieval household, which were limited but creative. The steward and the clerk of accounts managed the gap between the image and the reality, with the specific skill of people whose own security depended on keeping the lord solvent. They deferred certain expenses. They stretched certain payments. They managed creditors with the judicious combination of partial settlement, and promised future settlement that kept relationships functional without resolving the underlying imbalance. They presented accounts to the Lord in language that was accurate without being alarming, which is a specialized form of communication that requires both precision and discretion. The access. This created a kind of invisible hierarchy that ran parallel to and sometimes at odds with the formal one, and navigating both simultaneously was the specific skill of the successful castle insider. You needed to respect the formal hierarchy because it was the structure within which all formal action happened. You also needed to understand the invisible hierarchy because it was the structure within which all actual decisions happened. Getting the two confused, acting as if the formal rank were the real power, without understanding the informal influence that might be shaping the person who held the formal rank, was the kind of mistake that ended careers. The Lord's private chambers were the site where the two hierarchies converged. In formal terms, the Lord's private space was accessible only to those with specific roles: the chamberlain who managed it, the personal servants who attended it, the senior advisors who were invited to it for specific consultations. In practice, the management of who actually entered those chambers was the most carefully contested question in the castle's political life, because entering them regularly and being seen to enter them communicated access in a way that nothing else did, and access communicated influence, and influence was the currency that everything else was purchased with. The people who attended the Lord's person were in possession of information that was uniquely valuable. They knew his health before the household knew. They knew his moods with the intimacy of people who had observed them across many seasons and many circumstances. They knew the texture of his anger, the difference between the cold, calculating anger that resulted in measured and permanent consequences and the hot, immediate anger that burned through and left the air clear again. They knew the names that produced tension in his body when he heard them, and the subjects that caused him to become thoughtful rather than responsive, and the state of his sleep and the quality of his appetite and the small signals of physical condition that indicated how the man behind the Lord was actually doing. This knowledge, managed with discretion, was the foundation of their position. Mismanaged, shared inappropriately or at the wrong moment, it could end them as quickly as it had sustained them. The garrison's relationship to the castle's self-image had its own texture. The garrison was the justification for the castle's existence in its most fundamental sense, the force that made the walls defensible rather than merely symbolic. But the men who comprised it were not the idealized warriors of heraldic display. They were men doing a specific job in conditions that were physically demanding, frequently monotonous, occasionally dangerous, and not compensated at a level that made the discomforts trivial. Managing them required an ongoing engagement with the actual conditions of military service in an enclosed institution, which included the management of boredom and grievance, and the small internal economies of shared resources and mutual obligation that soldiers develop among themselves when they spend long periods in close quarters. The senior soldiers, the sergeants and veteran men-at-arms who had been in the household long enough to know everyone and to have developed relationships with the garrison's informal power structure, were valuable to the castle not just for their fighting capacity but for their ability to maintain the garrison's cohesion. A garrison that was internally functional, where grievances were addressed before they calcified, and where the informal hierarchy was reasonably aligned with the formal one, was a garrison that could be relied on. A garrison that was fractured, where unresolved conflicts had produced factional dynamics and undermined trust, was a garrison that might perform adequately in routine conditions and unpredictably in difficult ones. The people responsible for the castle's defence understood the difference, and managed accordingly, which meant managing the human environment of the garrison with as much attention as they managed the material equipment. The chapel functioned simultaneously as the castle's genuine spiritual centre and as one of its most important political spaces, and the distinction between the two functions was not always as clear as formal religious life preferred to suggest. Spiritual observance organised the household's time in a way that was not subject to the Lord's schedule or the demands of operations, which was genuinely useful for an institution that needed shared temporal reference points to function. The canonical hours, the pattern of prayer through the day, gave everyone in the household a common framework that transcended rank, which was one of the few things in castle life that actually did transcend rank. The visitors to the castle brought with them, in addition to whatever practical purpose their visit served, information about the outside world, news of political developments and military movements, and the state of relationships between houses, all of which the castle needed in order to manage its own position. This information was worth something. The management of it, who received it, and how it was shared through the household, and what was retained and what was communicated further, was itself a political act. The lord who received news first and distributed it selectively had an advantage over those who received it later. The household official who managed the flow of information had leverage. The messenger who carried it was, briefly and in a specific way, more important than his rank suggested. The castle existed in a network of such flows, of goods and people and information and obligation, and its functioning depended on managing those flows intelligently. The walls were the most visible part of this management, but not the most important. The most important part was the invisible architecture of relationships and obligations and calculations of interest that held the castle and its household together across the long, cold, complicated years of its existence. The lord commanded, but the command worked because everyone inside the walls had calculated that making it work was in their interest, and the calculation was renewed every day in the ordinary operations of the institution, in the management of food and weapons and access and information, and the performance of the ceremony that made the argument to the outside world about what all of this was and what it meant. There is a thread that runs through all of tonight's history, and it runs in the way that the important threads usually run, not through the dramatic moments, but through the ordinary and repeated ones. The castle courtyard before dawn when you're slightly late and the household has not waited, the child hostage who built his life on the single decision that his word would hold, the gate porter in the cold reading a face and trusting what the reading told him, the steward managing accounts that do not quite add up and presenting them with the language of stability, the lord's attendants carrying knowledge they cannot use and managing the weight of it with the discretion that their position required. These are the places where history happened, not in the declarations or the battles, though those occurred and mattered, in the ongoing human project of keeping things together when things did not naturally want to stay together. The patient management of the gap between what an institution claims to be and what it actually is. The construction of trust in contexts where it cannot be assumed. The gate porter, who understood that the gate was never simply a gate. William Marshal understood the architecture of trust from the age of 5, when the trust that should have been the most fundamental available to a child, the trust that his father would not calculate him expendable, was found to be conditional in ways that no child should have to learn. He spent the rest of his life constructing something more reliable than the trust he had been given, and the construction material was his own consistency. He did what he said he would do. Across 7 decades and multiple courts and multiple kings and the full range of pressures that medieval politics could generate, he did what he said he would do. And what he built from that consistency was not just a reputation, it was a form of structural support for the whole institution of medieval chivalric service, a demonstration that the system could work as it claimed to work when someone inside it held the values that the system officially required. The gate porter built something more modest but no less real. The knowledge of a road, the knowledge of faces, the knowledge of the difference between a pause that means thinking and a pause that means selecting. The kind of knowledge that cannot be taught quickly and cannot be faked, and that represents the accumulated investment of months of careful attention in cold weather at an early hour for no particular reward except the reward of being good at a thing that matters. The castle's inhabitants built the thing that was hardest to build and most necessary to build, the daily renewed decision that the image was worth maintaining, that the ceremony was worth performing, that the obligations were worth honouring. Not from naivety, from the clear-eyed understanding that the alternative, the unwinding of the whole arrangement, would be worse for everyone inside the walls, and that being inside the walls was, on balance and in the long run, better than the alternative. That's what history mostly is, not the dramatic departures from the norm, though those are what get recorded and remembered. The norm itself, the daily renewed decision to maintain the thing that took generations to build, made by people who will never be named in any account but whose contribution is the substance of everything that survived. You are horizontal in the dark, somewhere considerably more comfortable than a straw pallet beside a cold stone wall, in a world that inherited all of this without being told that it was inheriting it. The rule of institutions that require performance of loyalty alongside genuine loyalty, the gate of every organisation you have ever been part of, which is always managed by someone whose judgment is doing more work than their title suggests. The gap between the official image of any institution and the reality being managed behind it, which has been a feature of human institutions since before there were words for features or institutions. The castle settles now into its night arrangement. Fires low in the great hall, garrison awake in the watches, lord in his chamber with his thoughts and the weight of tomorrow already beginning to accumulate at the edge of sleep. The gate porter is at his post. The road is quiet in the way that roads are quiet at night, which is not empty but still, waiting for morning to bring back the full range of people and purposes that approach gates and ask to be let through. You do not have to go anywhere tonight. The road is not for you. The cold is not yours to manage. The portcullis is someone else's responsibility in the dark. Let the castle recede. Let the walls go quiet. Let the sentries do their work of softening and distancing and leaving only the shape of things and the quality of the people who lived inside them. Sleep well. Wait. Before that final image fades entirely, let us sit with it a moment longer. Because there is something in the texture of the castle that we move through quickly and that deserves more time. The physical reality of it. Not the military architecture which we have visited, but the material reality of living inside it day after day across months and years. Stone is cold. This is a statement so obvious it seems barely worth making, and yet the specific quality of the cold that comes from living inside a stone structure is something that does not translate well into description, partly because it is not one thing but many. In summer, the stone walls are genuinely useful, releasing a cool that persists through the hottest hours and makes the interior of a castle in July a relief from the fields outside. In autumn, as the year turns and the days shorten, the stone begins to do the opposite, holding the summer's warmth for a few weeks, and then releasing it, and then releasing only cold, the stored cold of the previous winter, the deep cold that lives in thick stone the way moisture lives in wood, pervasive and patient and not impressed by the fires you build against it. The warmth these fires produced was real but bounded. Within the radius of the fire you were warm. Beyond it you were negotiating with the ambient temperature. The hall was large because a large hall was part of what a great household looked like, and the larger the hall the more air there was to heat, and the less efficiently the fires heated it. The tables farthest from the fire were tables where you wore your coat. In the depths of winter, you wore your coat everywhere except when the ceremony of the occasion specifically required the performance of not minding the cold. Candles and torches provided the light of indoor life, and the quality of light they produced was functional in the general sense and inadequate in the specific sense. You could see. You could not see well. The flicker of torchlight and the uncertain glow of candles in a large stone space produced an environment in which shapes were visible, and detail was less so, and in which the parts of a room not close to a light source were genuinely dark in a way that modern interiors are almost never dark. The corners of rooms were dark. The upper reaches of walls were dark. The passages between buildings were dark at night, in ways that required you to know them well before moving through them quickly. You learned to know them well. You also learned that the assumption of darkness was not merely the absence of light, but a different quality of experience, one in which your hearing and your other senses compensated for what your vision was not providing, and in which the sounds of the castle at night had a different texture and weight from the sounds during the day. The smell of tallow candles is not pleasant in large quantities. The smell of torches is not pleasant at all. These were the primary light sources, and their byproducts, the soot and the smell and the grease of the tallow, were part of the material reality of indoor castle life in the same way that the damp of the stone was part of it, simply present, accommodated rather than addressed. The great hall's walls were darkened with the soot of years of fires and torches, and the tapestries that hung on them were partly decorative and partly functional, insulating slightly against the cold and softening the acoustic environment of a large stone room, which without them would have had the reverberant quality of a space that was not designed for the comfort of sound. The noise of the castle was constant during the day and a different kind of constant at night. During the day, the courtyard and the hall and the various service buildings produced the combined sound of a large institution at work, voices and movement and the sounds of crafts and animals and the ongoing mechanical operations of a household that was also a fortification. The smithy's hammer, the stable's particular mix of horse sounds and human management sounds, the kitchen's fire and the work being done over it, the movement of carts, the activity of people crossing the courtyard with purpose. At night, these sounds receded and were replaced by the night sounds of the castle, the passage of the garrison on the walls, the calls of the watch at their intervals, the occasional sound from the stables when an animal was restless, the wind on the battlements. The castle at night was not entirely quiet, but it had a different acoustic register, one in which the sounds that remained were more individually audible against the silence that surrounded them, and in which a sound that did not belong to the normal pattern of night sound stood out with the clarity of a word spoken at the wrong moment. The guards on the night watch maintained their position at the cost of sleep and cold, and the particular boredom of hours that contained very little variation. The watch was rotated because no one could maintain effective vigilance through an entire night without rest, and because effective vigilance was the point, and effective vigilance degraded with exhaustion. The system. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The system of watches divided the night into portions that each man could endure without his alertness failing significantly, though the hours just before dawn were the hours when alertness failed most, when the body's need for sleep pressed hardest against the obligation to remain awake, and when someone with detailed knowledge of the watch schedule might choose to act, if they were planning to act. This was understood by anyone who had thought carefully about the castle's defences. The hours before dawn were the vulnerable hours. The garrison knew this. The garrison's discipline was calibrated accordingly, not through harsh punishment for the drowsiness that inevitably came in those hours, but through the schedule of the watch itself, through the rotation that ensured the men in the most vulnerable hours were the ones who had slept most recently. This was practical management rather than romantic faith in human capacity. The animals of the castle had their own schedule and their own relationships to the institution. The horses were the most valuable, economically and militarily, and their management was accordingly careful. A great lord's horses were his military capacity in a direct and literal sense, his ability to move, to fight, to project force across distance. Losing horses to illness or injury or mismanagement was not an inconvenience, but a genuine diminishment of the household's capacity. The Marshal of the horses, whose title gave a direct indication of this role's importance, managed the horses with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he was managing was not livestock but military infrastructure. The hunting dogs occupied a different place in the economy of the castle. They were valuable in the practical sense that hunting was a significant source of protein and recreation for the household, but they were also valuable in the symbolic sense that the lord's hunting was an exercise of his dominion over the land, a demonstration of his relationship to the natural world that was politically and socially meaningful in ways that transcended the actual food value of the game produced. The dogs, therefore, were cared for well, housed in dedicated kennels, managed by dedicated keepers, and given a somewhat privileged relationship to the castle's common spaces that reflected their connection to the lord's personal activities. The chickens and the other domestic animals of the courtyard were valued for simpler and more direct reasons. They produced eggs and meat. They required relatively little management. They occupied the margins of the courtyard with the specific ease of animals that have been domesticated long enough to have made their peace with human environments, and have no particular interest in the abstract questions that their human cohabitants spend a great deal of time on. They were practical, in the medieval sense of the word, and their presence in the courtyard was not incidental but functional, part of the self-sufficient economy that a castle was designed to maintain. The self-sufficiency of the castle was an ideal that most castles pursued imperfectly, and some achieved reasonably well. The great castle had its own bakehouse and its own brewery, and its own kitchen gardens and its own orchard, and its own fish pond and its own granary and its own well, and all the other elements of an institution that needed to be able to sustain itself without recourse to external supply in the event that the world outside its walls became hostile to its interests. The granary was accordingly managed with the care of something that was not just a storage facility, but a strategic resource, and the person responsible for it was not simply a warehouse manager, but someone whose decisions about what to store and how much, and for how long, had genuine implications for the castle's ability to sustain itself under pressure. The well was, in a sense, the most important single element of the castle's self-sufficiency, because everything depended on water, and the well was how the castle ensured its access to water even when the external world was denied to it. The management of the well, the maintenance of its quality and its mechanism, the vigilance about what went into the water that served the whole household was accordingly serious work, and the specific concern about deliberate contamination of the water supply was a real one rather than a theoretical one, because contaminating a castle's water was one of the more effective approaches available to an enemy who could not breach the walls by direct assault. The armory was another strategic resource whose management was taken seriously in proportion to its military importance. Weapons deteriorated, armour required maintenance, the rivets of chainmail worked loose, the padding of plate armour compressed and stiffened, the hilts of swords loosened with use, and all of this maintenance needed to happen on a schedule that kept the garrison's equipment functional, rather than allowing it to degrade to the point where it was present but unreliable. The armourer's work was not glamorous in the way that the blacksmith's work could be, producing recognisable and admired objects. It was largely the work of maintenance and repair, the long patient work of keeping things in the condition that they needed to be in, which is the work that sustains all other work and which is rarely celebrated in proportion to its importance. The gardens of the castle, which might mean anything from a practical kitchen garden to an elaborate pleasure garden depending on the wealth and ambitions of the household, served several purposes simultaneously. They produced food, herbs for cooking and for medicine, flowers for the decoration of the hall on occasions when decoration was appropriate. They provided space for movement and fresh air that the enclosed environment of the castle interior did not always provide. They were, in some households, genuinely beautiful, places where the aesthetic impulses of the household were given physical expression in a form that was also functional. The management of a castle garden was itself a skill, combining agricultural knowledge with the spatial thinking of someone who understood how a space like this worked and what it needed to thrive. The castle's relationship to the village and the land around it was another dimension of its reality that the image of the castle as fortress tends to obscure. The castle was not separate from the land, it was embedded in it, dependent on it, governing it, and dependent on it in ways that were simultaneously economic and political and personal. The tenants on the lord's land produced the food and the rent and the labour that sustained the castle's operations. The castle provided the tenants with the protection and the governance and the administration of justice that made their own lives more predictable than they would otherwise be. This was a genuine exchange, not a simple exploitation, though the terms of it were not equal and the power differential was not subtle. The tenants knew the castle. They came to it for the administration of the manor court, where the disputes of agricultural life were adjudicated and the records of the estate were maintained. They came to it with their rents and their obligations, with the produce of the land that represented their part of the arrangement. They came to it in times of danger because the castle's walls were the walls that their own safety ultimately depended on, and the lord's garrison was the force that stood between them and whatever threat the world was currently generating. The castle was, from the perspective of the tenants, simultaneously an instrument of their governance, and the closest thing to a guarantee of their physical safety that their world provided. This relationship between the castle and its land was visible in the castle's daily operations in ways that were easy to overlook, but that constituted the actual substance of what a castle was for in the period when it was built and occupied. The great military moments, the sieges and the sorties and the battles, were the dramatic events that the castle's military architecture was designed to support. But the day-to-day reality was the governance of the land, the administration of the estate, the management of the relationships with the people whose labour and loyalty sustained the whole operation. The lord spent more of his time in the hall hearing cases and reviewing accounts and receiving the petitions of his tenants than he spent on horseback in the field, and the administrative work of a large estate was as demanding and as important as the military work that is more often remembered. The castle, understood in this way, was not primarily a weapon but a government. The walls and the garrison were the security that made the government possible, but the governance was the point, the reason the walls were there, the purpose for which the garrison was maintained. And governing a medieval estate meant managing a complex web of obligations and relationships, and disputes and resources that required intelligence and patience, and the specific kind of wisdom that comes from knowing a place and its people well over a long period. The lord who knew his tenants, who understood the history of the land disputes that came before his court, who could distinguish the genuine grievance from the opportunistic claim, was a better governor than the lord who had only his formal authority and his garrison. The people who worked for him in the administration of the estate, the steward and the bailiffs and the clerks who managed the accounts and the records, were accordingly valuable not just as employees, but as repositories of the institutional knowledge that made good governance possible. All of this, the cold and the ceremony and the politics and the finance and the governance and the garrison and the daily work of maintenance and management, was the castle. Not the part that appears in the records most often, because the records tend toward the dramatic and the formal, the part that was actually happening every day in the space between the banners and the battles. And the people who made it work were, as they always are, largely invisible in the record. The gate porter who kept the castle safe on the morning when something was wrong, and who caught it before it became something worse. The steward who balanced the accounts in ways that maintained the image of abundance. The chaplain who carried what he knew and managed it with the discretion his role required. The garrison soldiers in the cold hours before dawn, maintaining their alertness against the body's preference for sleep. The kitchen workers who produced the daily meals that kept the institution functioning. The grooms who managed the horses that made the whole military enterprise possible. These people did not expect to be remembered. They did not write anything down about what they did. The documents that survive are the documents of formal record, the legal instruments, and the chronicles, and the administrative records that the people at the top of the hierarchy produced and preserved because preservation served their interests. The people at the bottom left only the traces of what they built and what they maintained, the stones still standing after centuries, the institutions whose descendants continue in some form, the habits of mind and social practice that have been transmitted across generations by paths too indirect to trace. They are there, though, in the weight of the stone and the logic of the gate and the pattern of the ceremony, in the specific way that every large institution that has existed long enough has developed its own internal culture, its own invisible hierarchy alongside the formal one, its own management of the gap between image and reality. They built all of that. They built it every day, without recognition, without record, in the cold and the smell and the light of medieval torches and candles, and what they built lasted. That is the thing about the people who maintain institutions rather than found them. They are the ones who determine whether the founding was worth anything. The castle was built once. It was maintained every day after that for as long as it stood. The building was the dramatic event. The maintenance was the reality. And the reality is what the history was actually made of. Now we can let it go. The gate is closed, the fires are low, the watchers on the walls. The road below is empty in the way that roads are empty in the hours before dawn, not vacant but waiting, holding its breath for the morning when the world begins moving again and the gate opens and the exchange between the castle and the world recommences with the specific, ordinary miracle of institutions continuing to function because the people inside them decide every morning that they will continue to function. That decision, made by people who are cold and tired and not especially heroic in any single moment, is the most important decision in any institution's history. It is made without drama. It is made without recognition. It is made again and again and again by people who simply show up and do the thing that needs to be done, and in the doing of it, keep the whole arrangement going for another day. That is enough to marvel at if you look at it clearly, that it keeps going. That it keeps going because people decide it will. That people decide it will because they understand, however implicitly and however uncomfortably, that the arrangement is worth maintaining, and that maintaining it is their part to play. You are warm, you are still. The arrangement that surrounds you has its own maintenance workers, largely invisible and largely unrecognised, keeping things going in the cold hours when no one is watching closely. They are there. They have always been there. The castle's shadow falls across all of us. Sleep well. But before sleep fully arrives, and because we have been inside these walls long enough to know that there is always one more layer beneath the one you think is the bottom, let us spend a little more time with the specific texture of what we were examining, the gap between what the castle looked like and what it was, and what that gap tells us about the people who maintained it. Every large institution in human history has been at its core a managed performance, not in the dismissive sense that the word performance sometimes carries, the sense that implies dishonesty or artifice, or the substitution of appearance for substance. in the more fundamental sense that every institution exists partly in its own operations and partly in the perception of those operations by the people whose cooperation it needs. The church needed people to believe that its spiritual authority was real. The kingdom needed people to believe that the king's authority was legitimate. The castle needed people to believe that the power it housed was solid and reliable and backed by the capacity to enforce itself. Without that belief, the church was just a building, the king was just a man, and the castle was just a very expensive pile of stone. This is not cynicism. It is the recognition that human institutions are human, which is to say they are made of belief as much as they are made of matter, and that the belief is not separate from the institution but constitutive of it. The castle that no one believed in was not a weakened castle. It was not a castle at all, in any of the senses that mattered. The castle's function was inseparable from the belief in its function. The Lord's authority was inseparable from the belief in that authority. These are not illusions resting on a more real foundation. They are the foundation. What this means for the people maintaining the castle is that their work had a dimension that went beyond the practical. Every time the gate was managed correctly, every time the ceremony in the hall was conducted properly, every time the garrison presented itself in ordered readiness on the walls, the people doing those things were not just performing tasks. They were renewing the institution's claim on the belief that sustained it. The gate porter keeping the gate well was not just keeping the castle safe. He was maintaining the argument that the castle was the kind of place that was worth keeping safe, the kind of place whose protection could be relied upon, the kind of place whose wall meant something. He was one person doing one job in one morning, and he was also, without knowing or thinking about it in these terms, contributing to the ongoing construction of the idea of the castle. This is why institutions develop the specific emotional texture they develop, the particular combination of pride and obligation and belonging that makes people inside them feel that what they are doing matters beyond its immediate practical purpose. The gate porter was proud of keeping the gate well. The pride was not vanity. It was the recognition that the work mattered, that its quality had consequences, that the difference between doing it well and doing it badly was a real difference. The pride was appropriate. The work deserved it. And this is why the gap between image and reality in a castle was not simply a practical inconvenience or an ethical failing, but a genuine institutional risk. Every time the reality deviated significantly from the image, every time the accounts were in worse shape than the ceremony suggested, every time the garrison's cohesion was less reliable than the formation on the walls implied, the belief that sustained the institution was being tested. Most of the time, the gap between image and reality was manageable. It was managed by the people whose jobs included managing it, the steward and the senior household officials, and all the various people who kept the practical reality functioning well enough that the image could be maintained without requiring active deception. The cases where this management failed were the cases that appear in the historical record as crises. The castle that could not sustain a siege because the garrison was inadequate to the walls. The lord whose authority collapsed because the financial reality behind the ceremony had become too different from the ceremony to sustain. The household that fell apart because the trust relationships that held it together had been damaged past the point of repair. These failures were not failures of the image alone. They were failures of the institution, because the institution was, as we have established, made of belief as much as made of stone, and when the belief failed, the institution failed with it. What prevented these failures, most of the time, was the accumulated investment of people who cared about the work. The gate porter who was proud of keeping the gate well, the steward who managed the accounts with genuine skill and genuine concern for the institution's stability, the senior knight who maintained his loyalty not because loyalty was currently convenient, but because he understood that his word was the most valuable thing he possessed, the chaplain who carried his knowledge with discretion because discretion was what the role required, and he had committed to the role genuinely, not just instrumentally. These people were not special in any sense that the record has chosen to preserve. They were people doing their jobs well, which is the most common form of human virtue, and the form least likely to appear in chronicles and histories, because chronicles and histories are interested in the exceptional and the dramatic, and the well-doing of ordinary jobs is neither. But it is what made everything else possible. The exceptional moments of medieval history, the battles and the political transformations and the institutional crises, happened in a world that was mostly not exceptional. that was mostly people doing their jobs and maintaining their institutions, and keeping the arrangements going that made the exceptional possible when it arrived. William Marshal was exceptional. He was also, in the most important dimension of his exceptionalism, simply someone who did his job very well for a very long time. The word held, every time. That is not a heroic act in any single instance. Over 70 years, it becomes something that looks like heroism from a distance, because we can see the whole arc of it at once, the consistency sustained across everything that time and the medieval world threw against it. From inside the arc, it was just the daily decision to be the same person today as yesterday, to keep the commitment made last week in the conditions present this week, to honour the obligation assumed in a different context from the one currently operative. That is the most ordinary and the most difficult thing a person can do. Most people manage it for a while, and then something happens that makes keeping the commitment more costly than breaking it, and they break it, and the world continues. William Marshal did not break it, not once, across a career that covered multiple kingdoms and multiple kings, and the full range of pressures that medieval political life generated. He simply remained what he said he was, and what he was turned out to be exactly what the age needed, without his having chosen to meet the age's needs rather than simply choosing to be himself. This is the specific grace of people who are simply what they are, consistently and completely, in a world that applies various pressures to encourage them to be something else. They do not become what the moment requires by calculating what the moment requires and then adjusting. They remain what they are, and the moment finds them useful because what they are is genuinely useful, and the usefulness is not separate from the consistency, but is its product. The gate porter at his post in the cold morning is also this kind of person, not in the grand arc of William Marshal's career, not in any way that history will remember, but in the specific texture of a morning's attention, the quality of watchfulness that is not anxious but patient, that does not perform alertness but embodies it, because the embodiment is what the job requires, and what the job requires is what the person does. There is a wholeness to this that is worth naming. The person who is completely what their role requires them to be, not straining toward it, not performing it, simply being it, is the person on whom the institution depends, and the person whose work is largely invisible, because it produces no friction. Friction is visible, smooth function is not. The medieval castle depended on many people like this. Most of them are gone without record. The record kept what was unusual. The unusual thing was when the smooth function failed, when the gate was breached, when the garrison mutinied, when the accounts collapsed beyond management, when the Lord's authority was successfully challenged. These are the events in the chronicles. The decades of smooth function that surrounded them are the silence between the words, and the silence was the substance of most people's lives. That silence is where we are now. The castle in its night arrangement is in the silence between events, the long ordinary night that does not appear in any chronicle, because nothing happened during it that required recording. The garrison is on the walls, the gate is closed, the household is asleep in its various degrees of comfort. Tomorrow the bell will ring and the morning will begin, and the castle will recommence its daily performance of being what it claims to be, and the performance will be sustained by the accumulated investment of people who care about the work they do there. And the world outside the walls will continue to believe in the castle's authority, and the authority will continue to function, and the arrangement will go on. This has been happening for a long time. It will go on for a long time after the specific castle we have been visiting tonight is reduced to foundations, and the foundations are reduced to the slight irregularity in a field that tells an archaeologist something important was here once, and that tells the person walking across the field in the ordinary business of their day nothing at all, because the person walking across the field does not know to look, and has not been told what the irregularity in the ground means, and the accumulated weight of what happened here has been absorbed into the earth, and the silence and the darkness that lies under all of us. We carry it anyway, in the way institutions work, in the way trust is built and maintained and tested, in the specific quality of attention that a threshold requires, in the understanding that what you say and what you do are either the same thing or they are not, and that the difference between those two conditions accumulates over years into something you either have or you do not have, and that having it is worth the daily cost of maintaining it. The castle was the most complete argument its era could make about power and order, and the organisation of human life around a defensible centre. We have not outgrown the argument. We have reformulated it in the materials of later centuries. The centre is different, the walls are different, the ceremony is different, the gap between image and reality is not different, the work of the people who manage that gap is not different. They're at their posts, as they always have been, in the cold, in the dark, doing the thing that needs to be done, keeping the arrangement going for another day. You can sleep now, the walls are standing, the gate is closed, the watch is awake. Sleep well. And yet we have not spent enough time inside the particular discomfort of the castle's relationship to siege, which is the context the castle was designed for, and which every person who lived inside one understood, at some level, as the background condition of their existence. Not that sieges happened constantly, they did not. Most castles spent most of their existence without experiencing a siege at all, but the possibility was structural. It was built into the walls and the gate and the cistern and the granary and every other element of the castle that was designed to sustain a population under conditions of external hostility. The people inside if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The people inside the castle knew this. It was part of what the castle was, and knowing it, even when the knowledge was largely theoretical, shaped how they related to everything else. The practical preparation for siege was ongoing. The granary was maintained at a level that reflected the number of people the castle would need to sustain, and the number of weeks that a credible siege might last. And the specific calculation of those two numbers was a real administrative task rather than an abstract exercise. The well was maintained with the specific anxiety of people who understood that the well's quality and accessibility could be the difference between holding and not holding. The weapons were kept in condition. The garrison was kept at a size that could man the walls effectively, and that size was calibrated against the wall's total length and the specific defensive requirements of the castle's configuration. The experience of an actual siege, which fewer people inside any given castle would have than the preparation suggested, was one of the more extreme environments that the medieval world could produce for someone who was not a soldier by profession. The first days of a siege, when the situation was still being assessed and the terms might still be negotiated, had an almost ordinary quality. The castle continuing its internal operations with the added information that the world outside the gate was currently organised in opposition rather than the usual indifferent neutrality. The gates were closed, obviously. The garrison was deployed. Routines were adjusted to reflect the military situation, but the castle was still the castle, and the people in it were still doing the things they did, if with a somewhat different quality of attention. The later days of a siege, if it extended past the point where resolution by negotiation was still available, had a different quality. The supplies that had seemed adequate at the beginning became something to be rationed, and then to be rationed more severely as the days extended. The water that flowed freely in ordinary circumstances became precious in the way that everything that is finite becomes precious when the finiteness becomes visible. The space of the castle, which in ordinary circumstances was sometimes cramped and sometimes adequate, became crowded as everyone within the walls moved toward the most defensible locations, and the cramped quality of too many people in a confined space under stress produced the social dynamics that confined spaces under stress always produce. The sound of siege engines outside the walls was one of the specific sounds of this experience, the deep impact of projectiles against stone, and the particular sound that stone makes when it is being damaged, which is different from the sound of stone being struck without damage, and which becomes, over the course of a siege, the sound of the castle's gradual deterioration under pressure. The defenders on the walls were managing this deterioration, while also managing the human projectiles, the arrows and bolts and various thrown things that the attacking force directed at anyone visible above the parapet. The work of defence was physically demanding and intermittently terrifying, in the specific way that being shot at is terrifying, and the people doing it were doing it not from abstract heroism, but from the practical calculation that the alternative, the fall of the castle, was worse. The negotiations that punctuated sieges were their own art form in the medieval world. The conventions governing what could be asked and offered in a siege negotiation were quite specific, with established rules about when a garrison could surrender honourably and when surrender would be considered a betrayal of obligation. The timing mattered. A garrison that surrendered before making any resistance was judged differently from one that surrendered after genuine defence, and when the situation was clearly hopeless. The lord of the castle, negotiating from inside the walls, was working within these conventions while also working within his own immediate constraints of supplies and garrison morale and the condition of the walls and the probability of relief arriving from outside. The besieger, working from outside, was doing the same calculation in reverse, weighing the costs of continuing the siege against the potential benefits of its successful conclusion, the time and resources and weather that a prolonged siege consumed against the strategic value of the castle and its lord. The resolution of a siege, however it came, always left something behind. The castle that had been besieged and had held was a castle whose claim to authority had been tested and maintained, and that tested maintenance was worth something, sometimes more than the original unchallenged claim. The castle that had fallen was a castle whose image had been definitively contradicted, and the process of rebuilding both the physical structure and the authority it housed was significant. The lord who had surrendered honourably might retain his life and some of his possessions. The lord who had surrendered after failing in his basic obligations of defence might find that the obligations the world owed him had been similarly reduced. This is the castle under maximum pressure, and it explains why the normal management of the castle, the careful attention to supplies and garrison and gate and ceremony, was not simply administrative housekeeping, but preparation for an event that might or might not come, and whose arrival would test everything the housekeeping had built. The gate porter who kept the gate well was not just preventing today's unauthorised entry, he was contributing to the accumulated reliability of the castle's defences, the reputation of the place as somewhere that could not be easily penetrated, which was a form of deterrence that might prevent the siege from being attempted at all. The steward who managed the supplies carefully was not just keeping the household fed, he was maintaining the margin that would make the difference between sustaining a siege long enough to negotiate from strength and being forced to terms before that point was reached. All of the ordinary work was, at some level, preparation for the extraordinary. This is true of institutions generally, but the medieval castle made it visible in a way that few other institutions have, because the extraordinary, the siege and the assault and the violence for which the castle was explicitly designed, was not just possible in theory, but concretely imaginable by everyone inside. The walls made it imaginable, the garrison made it imaginable, the weapons in the armoury and the supplies in the granary made it imaginable. The castle was always, simultaneously, a household and a fortress, and the people living in it were always, simultaneously, household staff and a population under potential military threat, and the management of those two conditions at once was the specific task of everyone inside. They managed it. Day after day, in the ordinary operations of an institution that was also a military installation, they maintained the readiness that the military installation required while conducting the household operations that the institution required, and they did it in the context of a hierarchy that organised both dimensions of the castle's existence simultaneously. The steward who managed the food supply was managing a military resource and a household resource in the same operation. The gate porter who managed arrivals was managing social access and military security in the same judgment. The chaplain who provided spiritual support was also providing the morale management that a population under potential threat required. None of these people had separate hats for their military and household roles. The roles were fused, which was the specific genius of the castle as an institution. That fusion is what made the castle work. It was not a military installation with a household attached to make it habitable. It was not a household with walls added for protection. It was something that was both at once, seamlessly, continuously, maintained by people who understood both dimensions of what they were doing and who managed them with the integrated intelligence that comes from long familiarity with a complex task. The complexity of the task is part of why the castle persists in memory and imagination long after the specific military context that made it necessary has passed. The castle was not just a building or even an institution. It was a way of organising human life around the simultaneous requirements of security and community, of readiness and continuity, of authority and service. The specific answers the medieval castle gave to those requirements were products of its specific time and context, but the requirements themselves have not changed, and every institution that attempts to address them is, in some sense, a descendant of the castle, working with the same basic tensions and the same basic tools, in different materials and different forms for different specific purposes, but recognisable in its fundamental logic to anyone who has spent time inside the grey walls and understood what the walls were for. The gate is still everywhere. It is the threshold of every institution that controls its own membership, that manages the boundary between inside and outside, that maintains the distinction between the people whose presence is authorized and the people whose presence is not. It is managed everywhere by people who develop, through practice, the quality of judgment that distinguishes legitimate from illegitimate, safe from unsafe, the story that holds from the story that does not quite hold. Those people are largely invisible in the records of the institutions they serve. Their work shows most clearly in its absence, in the morning when something comes through that should not have come through, when the thing that was kept out was something that needed to be kept out, when the gate failed and the consequences arrived. The gate porter at his post in the cold morning is at work everywhere, in the forms the role takes in the institutions of later centuries, in the security desk at the entrance and the verification system at the digital threshold, and the interview process that decides who enters the institution and who does not. The specific medieval version of this role has the quality that all original versions of persistent human functions have, the quality of being close to the bone, of not having the layers of abstraction and bureaucratic mediation that accumulate over centuries of institutional refinement. The gate porter stands there and looks at the person and decides. No system behind the decision, no process to defer to, the decision and the judgment that generates it directly, immediately in the cold morning light. That directness is part of why the medieval castle persists as an image in the imagination of people who have never lived anywhere near one and have no particular historical interest in the period it belongs to. It offers a version of human organisation that is stripped of the complexity that later centuries added, that shows the bones of the institution clearly: authority, hierarchy, the management of access, the gap between image and reality, the daily renewal of the collective decision to keep the arrangement going. These are the bones. The flesh is different in every century and every culture. The bones are the same. And underneath the bones is the people. Always the people. The ones who showed up in the cold and did the thing that needed doing and went back to their straw pallet and got up the next morning and did it again. The ones whose names are not in any chronicle and whose work is visible only in the continued existence of what they maintained. The ones who, across every period of human history, in every institution that has ever existed, have been the actual substance of the thing, the continuous investment of human attention and effort and commitment that makes the walls mean something. Those people are still there, in the forms they take in each new period. They are the ones keeping things going right now, in the institutions that surround your life, in the operations that you depend on and rarely think about. They are at their posts. The gate is managed. The supplies are accounted for. The things that need to be maintained are being maintained by people you will never know, doing work you will never see, in the hours you spend sleeping and the hours you spend doing the things that the world's infrastructure makes possible. Sleep then, in the knowledge that the arrangement is being maintained, that somewhere in the cold and the dark someone is at the gate, that the word holds, that the work continues. Sleep well. And there is one more thread we have not fully followed, one that runs through everything we have discussed tonight, and that deserves its own examination before we let the castle fully recede into the dark. The thread of what rules actually were in the medieval castle, how they came to exist, how they were enforced, and why some of them could genuinely get you killed. The rules of a medieval castle were not written down for new arrivals. This was not an oversight. It was a structural feature of the institution, and understanding why it was a feature rather than a failure tells you something important about how medieval social life worked at its most basic level. Rules that are written down can be argued with. They can be interpreted. They can be compared to other written rules and found to conflict or to contain loopholes or to leave certain situations unaddressed. Written rules invite the kind of systematic engagement with their limits that produces the legal and bureaucratic cultures that later centuries would develop extensively. Medieval castle rules were not written down because the castle's authority did not want to invite that engagement. The rules were the Lord's will, expressed through the accumulated practice of the household, and the Lord's will was not something that was in principle subject to the kind of examination that written codification makes possible. This meant that knowing the rules was itself a form of access. If you did not know the rules, you could not follow them, and if you could not follow them, you could not function in the household, and if you could not function in the household, you were not in the household for long. The transmission of the rules happened through exactly the mechanism you have already experienced, through observation of others, through the social cost of getting things wrong, through the occasional direct instruction from someone above you who had decided your ignorance had become noticeable enough to address. The rules were learned by living inside them, and the learning was the proof that you belonged. Some rules carried consequences that were mild and recoverable. Arriving late, missing an obligation, getting a protocol wrong in a way that had no serious impact on anyone above you in the hierarchy. These produced the social costs of a temporary reduction in standing, the cool look from the steward, the slightly pointed attention of a senior colleague. They were recoverable through subsequent correct performance, through demonstrating that the error was not indicative of a pattern but was simply the mistake of someone still learning. The castle's hierarchy was not infinitely forgiving of repeated errors in the same direction, but it was willing to absorb the first several examples of a new person's unfamiliarity with the rules as the cost of acquiring a functional household member. Other rules carried consequences that were not recoverable, and that came quickly, with the directness that medieval institutions specialised in. These were the rules in proximity to the castle's most essential security and the Lord's most essential authority. You did not steal from the Lord's stores in any significant quantity, because stealing from the Lord was an attack on the household's capacity to function and on the Lord's ability to maintain his position, and the response to that attack was calibrated accordingly. You did not betray information about the castle's defences or the Lord's plans to anyone outside the walls, because the consequences of that betrayal fell on everyone inside the walls, and the response was also calibrated accordingly. You did not lay hands on the Lord's person without authorization, because the Lord's physical safety was the centre around which the entire institution organised itself, and violating that centre was the most serious possible violation of the institution's logic. These rules were not explained in detail when you arrived because they did not need to be. They were so fundamental to the castle's existence that everyone who had lived inside any similar institution already understood them before arriving, and anyone who did not understand them was either very young or very naive, and very young or very naive people were managed in the household in ways that kept them from proximity to the situations where the most serious rules operated until they had developed the judgment the proximity required. Between these two extremes, the mild and the severe, were the rules that occupied the interesting space, the ones where the consequences were real but where the application depended on context and relationship and the specific circumstances in which the rule was broken. The rule about unauthorized entry into the Lord's private chambers carried different consequences depending on who you were and why you were there, and what the Lord's relationship to you was at the moment of the discovery. The gate porter who wandered into the solar out of curiosity would find himself in a different situation from the senior knight, whose relationship with the Lord gave him a more ambiguous authorization, and a different situation again from the household servant whose presence there was discovered at a moment of political tension that made the presence read as something more than innocent curiosity. The castle's rules were, in this sense, not so much a code as a language, a set of conventions whose meaning was contextual and whose application required interpretive judgment from everyone who participated in them. The Lord interpreted them in specific cases from the position of the person whose will they expressed. The senior household officials interpreted them in their day-to-day management from the position of people who understood both the Lord's specific preferences and the general principles the rules embodied. The household members interpreted them in their own behaviour from the position of people who were trying to navigate the institution successfully without complete information. This meant that understanding the rules was never complete and was always in progress. The household member who thought they had mastered the rules and could therefore relax their attention was the household member who was most likely to miss the way a rule had shifted, the way a Lord's priorities had changed, the way a relationship that had made a certain behaviour acceptable had cooled and now made the same behaviour problematic. The rules were not static. They breathed with the life of the institution, adjusting as the institution adjusted, and following them required following that adjustment, which required the kind of continuous attention that the really successful castle inhabitants maintained as a permanent quality of their engagement with their environment. The consequences of getting rules wrong in the middle range, the range that was neither trivially recoverable nor immediately severe, were often the most instructive because they happened slowly enough to be observed and analysed. A household member who accumulated a pattern of small rule violations, each individually explicable, but together suggesting a disposition toward the castle's conventions that was insufficiently respectful, would find that pattern expressing itself in a gradual withdrawal of the small kindnesses and considerations that made household life tolerable. Slightly worse assignments, slightly less favourable positioning at table, the slight but perceptible cooling of relationships that had previously been warm. These were not punishments in any formal sense. They were the household's social response to behaviour it was reading accurately. And sometimes the accumulation passed a threshold and became something more formal. The household member who was found to have been consistently unreliable in small ways could find themselves the subject of a conversation with the steward that was not, strictly speaking, a disciplinary hearing, but that had the quality of one, a setting of expectations and the clear communication that the expectations had not been met, and that continued failure to meet them had consequences. Whether this conversation was the last warning or simply the latest in a pattern depended on whether the behaviour changed afterward. Some people changed after such conversations. They understood what had been communicated, adjusted their behaviour, and found that the adjustment was noted and that the coolness that had preceded it gradually warmed again. The castle was not unforgiving. It was assessing. The assessment was ongoing. Good performance after poor performance was read as evidence of the capacity to improve, which the castle valued, because the castle needed people who could be developed rather than only people who arrived fully formed. Some people did not change. The ones who did not change either left the household, which might happen formally at the end of a contract, or informally when they decided the household's assessment of them was unlikely to improve and that a different institution offered better prospects, or they remained in the household at a level of standing that reflected the household's assessment and that did not improve further. These people were not necessarily unhappy. They were calibrated, they knew where they stood, and standing somewhere with certainty, even at a lower level than might be wished, was its own kind of stability. The lords themselves were subject to rules, though the nature of the rules that applied to them was quite different from the rules that applied to their household members. The lord was subject to the rules of his own rank, to the conventions of his relationships with his king and his peers and his tenants, and to the internal rules of his own castle that he had in principle himself established. In practice, of course, a lord who was consistently arbitrary or consistently unjust in his application of the castle's rules damaged the household's functioning, because the household's functioning depended on everyone's ability to predict what the rules meant and to calibrate their behaviour accordingly. A lord whose rules were unpredictable produced a household that was continuously anxious, and continuous anxiety produces the kind of behavioural creativity that lords did not generally find useful. The best lords were, in this sense, consistent, not inflexible, not unable to respond to circumstances, but recognisable in their responses, predictable enough that the people who worked for them could manage the castle's operations with confidence that they understood what good performance looked like. William Marshal was this kind of person, in the households and lordships he managed, consistently enough that the people who worked for him knew what was expected, and the expectations were stable enough to build on. This is a form of leadership that does not always receive the attention that more dramatic forms receive, but it is the form that makes institutions actually function, and its absence is felt immediately and destructively in ways that its presence never quite announces. The rules of the castle, written nowhere and known everywhere, were the accumulated expression of the institution's understanding of what it needed to function. They were imperfect, inconsistent in their application, subject to the variable judgment of the people who administered them, and the variable circumstances in which they operated. They were also, in their aggregate effect, the mechanism by which the castle organised the behaviour of a large group of people with diverse interests and managed the ongoing social dynamics of a complex enclosed institution. They worked, more often than not, well enough to keep the castle going, and keeping the castle going was the point. That is the honest assessment of the medieval castle's rules. They worked imperfectly, inconsistently, in ways that reflect the humanity of everyone involved in making them work, and they produced, across the centuries of the castle's operational life, the thing that the castle was built to produce, an institution that was organised, defensible and continuous, that could sustain the lord's authority and the household's function across the full range of conditions the medieval world generated. It is not a romantic assessment, it is a realistic one, and the realistic assessment is, in the end, more interesting than the romantic one, because the realistic one contains actual people doing actual work in actual conditions, which is always more interesting than the version where everything is polished and nobody's back hurts and the bread is not dense and the cold is merely atmospheric rather than persistent and personal. The people who lived in the medieval castle were people. They woke up before they wanted to. They ate what was available rather than what they preferred. They navigated a hierarchy that rewarded the performance of qualities they did not always possess, and that punished the exhibition of qualities they did possess, but that were inconvenient for the institution. They built relationships in conditions that were not designed for comfort, and they maintained those relationships across the long years of shared difficulty that castle life produced. They kept the gate, they kept the granary, they kept the accounts as honest as they could keep them, and the image as accurate as they could maintain it, and the ceremony as meaningful as the ceremony could sustain. They did the work that needed doing, in the place they were, with the tools they had, in the time they were given. That is what they were, that is what we all are. The castle just made it visible in a particularly clear and particular way. The walls around it, the gates at its boundary, the hierarchy inside, the rules that everyone knew and nobody wrote down, the gap between what it claimed to be and what it was, managed every day by the people whose lives it constituted. Sleep then. The gap is managed. The gate is closed, the watch is awake. The arrangement continues. Sleep well. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. There is one more thing worth saying before the night settles fully in. The medieval castle is gone, mostly. What remains are the ruins, walls standing to half their original height, towers open to the sky, staircases that end abruptly 3 meters above the ground, where the floor they once served has long since fallen away. You can walk through them, these ruins, and read something of the original structure in the surviving stone. Here was the Great Hall. Here the kitchen, placed carefully away from the main buildings to reduce fire risk. Here the well, at the centre of the bailey, where everyone came in the morning for water. Here, at the gate, the groove worn into the stone by 1,000 years of portcullis cable, moving up and down through the same channel. The groove in the stone is the most affecting thing if you stop to consider it. It is the accumulated wear of ordinary operation, the portcullis raised each morning for the day's traffic, lowered each evening, raised the following morning again. It is the physical record of routine repeated until it wore the stone. The engineers who built the castle did not intend that groove. They built the channel precisely, calculated to allow the portcullis cable to operate with minimal friction. The groove developed over time through use, the cable polishing the stone by degrees until the polishing became wearing, and the wearing became the groove you can trace with your finger now, 700 years later. That groove contains everyone who ever operated that portcullis. The gatekeeper who stood at the threshold and read faces in the uncertain morning light. The assistant who turned the mechanism on the first day and got the timing wrong. The head porter with 11 years of accumulated pattern recognition, whose hands did the operation automatically while his attention remained on the traveller at the gate. All of them, and all the others, whose names the records did not trouble to preserve, are present in that groove. The stone remembers the work even when the people who did the work have been long forgotten. This is what survives in the end. Not the names of the great lords, though those survive too in the chronicles and the charters and the careful genealogies, maintained by the families who wanted their descent recorded. Not the ceremonies, though those survive in the records of the households that documented their procedures. What survives most honestly is the groove in the stone, the wear pattern, the physical evidence of ordinary work repeated until it became permanent. You are yourself, somewhere in the middle of your own groove making. The routines that structure your days, repeated enough times, produce wear patterns you will not see until much later, when you are able to look back at the channel you have worn through the stone of your own life, the morning routine, the particular way you read the faces of people at the threshold of your attention and decide whether to open or hold. The accumulated judgment of years of practice that now operates slightly below the level of conscious decision. The medieval gatekeeper would recognise this. William Marshal would recognise this. The cook managing the kitchen accounts, the chaplain carrying the weight of what he knew, the garrison soldier on the North Tower wall watch in the cold of the pre-dawn hours, all of them would recognise this. They were doing their version of the same work in the conditions their time provided, with the tools their world had given them. The tools are different now. The walls are different. The hierarchy has different names, organised around different mechanisms. But the fundamental operation, waking up before you want to, doing the work that needs doing, maintaining the arrangements that keep things going, carrying what you know with appropriate discretion, building pattern recognition over years until the knowledge operates quietly in the background, that operation is the same. It has always been the same. The groove in the stone says so. So now, the castle is settled, the watch is at their posts, the gate is closed and the portcullis lowered, and the accounts are balanced as well as they can be balanced, and the ceremony performed as well as it can be performed, and the lord has retired, and the household has quieted, and the night is doing what the night has always done, which is provide the darkness and the quiet necessary for rest. You have travelled a long way through the medieval world tonight. You have stood at the gate and learned the work of reading travellers. You have followed a small boy through 60 years of a life that bent but did not break. You have eaten in the great hall and slept in the cold, and navigated the invisible rules of an institution that asked everyone in it to perform slightly better versions of themselves. You have done enough. The night is very quiet now. The stones are cold in that familiar way, and the fire has burned down to coals, and the sounds of the castle at rest are the sounds of the castle at rest. Ordinary, rhythmic, continuous. Sleep now, deep and untroubled. The groove is there in the morning. The work continues in the morning. The gate opens in the morning. But that is morning, and this is not morning. This is the long, dark, still middle of the night, which belongs entirely to rest. Sleep well? Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.